Most people who are financially stuck are not stuck because they are careless. They are stuck because they are doing things that feel responsible, things that feel like progress, things that, by almost every conventional measure, look like the right behavior. And that is precisely what makes the situation so difficult to identify and even harder to interrupt. The most dangerous financial patterns are not the obvious ones. They are not the reckless spending decisions or the clear and visible failures of discipline. Those are easy to recognize and relatively straightforward to correct. The patterns that cause the most damage over time are the ones that carry the feeling of correctness. The ones that produce a quiet and convincing sense that you are managing your financial life responsibly, while the underlying structure remains unchanged and the stagnation compounds silently beneath the surface. This is not primarily a discipline problem. It is a psychological one. The behaviors that keep intelligent and hard-working people stuck are almost always behaviors that once made complete sense, that were socially reinforced, that felt earned, and that produced just enough visible result to avoid serious examination. The first pattern is so normalized it is nearly invisible. Every time income increases, the lifestyle expands to meet it. Not dramatically and not irresponsibly in any single moment, but consistently and automatically, as though higher earnings come with a revised and elevated baseline of what daily life is now supposed to look like. The raise arrives, and the apartment improves, and the car is upgraded, and the restaurants become slightly more expensive, and the vacations become slightly more elaborate. Each decision is individually justifiable. Collectively, they ensure that the margin between income and expenditure remains permanently narrow, regardless of how much the income itself has grown. Closely related to this is the way most people think about saving. Saving is treated as whatever remains after everything else has been addressed. The residual at the end of the month after the obligations and the lifestyle and the small and large rewards have all been satisfied. Which means that in most months, saving is the first thing to be quietly reduced when the system runs close to its limits. When saving is positioned last, it functions as the system's shock absorber rather than its foundation. And a shock absorber, by design, is compressed precisely when conditions are most difficult. Then there is the habit of rewarding yourself too frequently, and for thresholds that have been set low enough to be consistently reached. The reward itself is rarely the problem. The problem is what the reward communicates to the psychology managing the system. It communicates that the current level of effort and the current level of result are sufficient to deserve celebration. And that communication, repeated consistently, reduces the tolerance for the extended and unrewarded periods of patience that genuine wealth accumulation structurally requires. Many people confuse activity with financial progress in ways that feel productive, but consume resources without building anything durable. Researching investments without deploying capital. Monitoring portfolios without having a framework for what the monitoring is supposed to produce. Reading extensively about financial concepts while the structural decisions that actually determine outcomes remain unaddressed. The activity generates the feeling of engagement and diligence, but engagement and diligence in the wrong direction do not compound in any useful way. There is also the quiet and consistent avoidance of the specific discomforts that financial growth requires. The discomfort of genuine risk taken with meaningful capital. The discomfort of learning things that challenge the current understanding. The discomfort of delayed gratification extended long enough to actually matter. These discomforts are not avoided through laziness. They are avoided because the psychological cost of each one feels disproportionate in the moment it is encountered, and the financial cost of avoiding them remains invisible for long enough to never feel urgent. One of the more subtle patterns is the tendency to optimize aggressively for small and visible expenses while leaving the large structural ones largely unexamined. The daily coffee becomes a subject of careful consideration. The subscription services are audited with genuine attention. But the career that generates below-market compensation, the living situation that consumes a structurally excessive portion of income, the financial products that extract quietly and consistently across years, these receive far less scrutiny because they are less visible in daily experience and more psychologically costly to address. The optimization feels thorough. The structure it leaves untouched is where most of the actual damage accumulates. Needing visible results too quickly is another pattern that feels like healthy ambition, but functions as a constraint on the behaviors that produce durable outcomes. Compounding is not a process that produces regular and satisfying visible confirmation of its own progress. It produces long periods of apparent stagnation, followed by results that arrive unevenly and often without warning. The investor who needs consistent visible confirmation abandons the process before the results have had sufficient time to materialize, not from impatience in any crude sense, but from a psychological architecture that was built in environments where effort and result were more closely and reliably correlated. Many people copy the financial behaviors of those who appear successful without understanding the context, the timing, or the underlying structure that made those behaviors produce the observed results. The investment that worked for someone else at a different stage, with different capital, different risk tolerance, and different structural circumstances, is adopted as though the outcome transfers along with the behavior. It rarely does. And the person who copies the behavior without understanding its foundations is left with the cost of the approach and none of the conditions that made it viable. There is also the deeply embedded tendency to overvalue income and undervalue time and optionality. Income is measurable, immediate, and socially legible. Time and optionality are abstract, deferred, and invisible to everyone observing from outside the decision. So decisions that trade significant time and flexibility for marginal income increases feel like rational optimization when they are often the opposite. The hours traded cannot be recovered. The optionality surrendered often proves more valuable than the income received in exchange for it. Staying in stable but structurally low upside situations, because the stability itself feels like a form of financial responsibility, is a pattern that accumulates cost across years without ever producing a single moment that registers as a visible mistake. The stability is real. The ceiling it imposes is also real, and the decade spent in comfortable proximity to that ceiling is a decade not spent building towards something without one. Finally, there is perhaps the most pervasive pattern of all. Making financial decisions whose primary purpose is to reduce anxiety rather than to improve outcomes. The decision that feels like it resolves something urgent. The reallocation that makes the current moment feel more controlled and more manageable. The choice that prioritizes the relief of the person making it over the interests of the future they are supposedly building toward. These decisions feel responsible because the anxiety they resolve is genuinely uncomfortable and the relief they provide is genuinely real. But anxiety reduction and outcome improvement are not the same objective. And a financial life managed primarily around the former will consistently and quietly underperform the one managed around the latter. What makes all of these patterns so durable is not ignorance. It is the way they are experienced from inside the psychology that produces them. They feel responsible because they were taught as responsible. They feel deserved because the effort that precedes them is real. They feel productive because they generate the internal signals that productive behavior produces in other domains. Social conditioning has framed most of them as virtues. Identity has been built around them in ways that make honest examination feel like self-criticism rather than self-understanding. And the dopamine produced by progress-like actions, the research completed, the expense reduced, the reward collected, is real enough to satisfy the system's need for confirmation that things are moving in the right direction. When these patterns compound across time, the result is a specific and recognizable financial profile: high income and relatively low net worth. A life that requires continuous and non-negotiable effort to maintain at its current level. No meaningful margin between what the system costs and what it requires to sustain. And a delayed and gradually uncomfortable realization that despite doing most things correctly by conventional standards, the structural position has not fundamentally changed in proportion to the years and the effort invested in it. The intelligence that might be expected to protect against this often makes it worse in specific and observable ways. Intelligent people do not fall into these patterns because they failed to think carefully about them. They fall into them because they thought carefully enough to construct convincing justifications for each one at the moment it was adopted. The rationalization is sophisticated, the comfort it protects is real, and the narrative built around the current approach is coherent enough to make deviation from it feel like error rather than correction. Wealth is not primarily built by adding more correct behaviors to the ones already in place. It is built by identifying and systematically removing the behaviors that quietly and persistently work against the outcome being sought, not dramatically and not through any single act of recognition or correction, but through the gradual and honest examination of what the current system is actually designed to produce versus what it is being asked to produce. The gap between those two things is where the real work is, and it begins not with doing more, but with looking clearly at what the things already being done are actually compounding towards.